I have a question for you. Do you have a reminder on your phone to brush your teeth? Hmm? Well, probably not, or hopefully not. I'm not a dentist, but I would assume that that's a good thing. If we go back about 100 years ago, the government had decided that there was a national security risk because so many of World War I recruits were coming in with rotten teeth. It wasn't that there weren't products on the market, but only 7% of American households had any kind of toothpaste or dental cleaning product. It wasn't a lack of knowledge because clearly the government had declared that there was an issue. And it wasn't that, again, that the products weren't available. So what was it? What has changed from that time frame to now? Well, I would like to share with you some information that I have found in my research around habits based on this book, The Power of Habits, Why We Do What We Do in Life and in Business, written by Charles Duhigg, an investigative journalist. There's a lot of references to scientific studies and interviews with psychologists in this book, and I found the whole topic entirely fascinating. He defines a habit, and I'm going to refer to some of my notes here, as a choice that we deliberately make at some point and then stop thinking about it, but continue to do often and every day, so much so that it becomes automatic. And if you think about it, our lives are really a series of habits, things that we do kind of without thinking every single day, all the time, from how we brush our teeth to how we put our shoes on to how we, menu plan or cook dinner or when we exercise. Our lives are a series of habits. In fact, I love this quote by F.M. Alexander, who is an actor who developed movement modalities and movement habits that he actually is still for sale today as a program. But he says, people do not decide their futures, they decide their habits, and their habits decide their futures. So hopefully after I kind of go through what I've learned, you'll be able to see a little bit about the difference between where you're making conscious decisions and where habits are at play. And maybe evaluate what you might want to change and give you some tools and tips on how to make those changes. So back to that question about the reminder to brush your teeth and what happened. In a short time frame, basically 10 years, that percentage from 7% went to 65% of American households had toothpaste. And in large part, that was due to an advertising campaign that Claude Hopkins, one of the premier ad man back in the day, came up with. He basically didn't do anything too extraordinary or anything that wasn't necessarily out. People knew that if you brushed your teeth that it would be better. But what he hooked into is what Charles Duhigg and researchers call the habit loop. So I'm going to share my screen here and talk to you a little bit about what a habit loop is. This is the habit loop. I'm going to zoom in a little bit maybe. And we have in the habit loop a cue, which is a trigger that tells your brain which routine to use, a routine, the physical, mental, or emotional behavior that follows the cue, and the reward, the positive stimulus that tells your brain the reward is satisfying. And these are all basically driven by a craving. And in the case of what Hopkins did, as Duhigg explains in the book, is that contrary to what other advertisers and advertisements had done, is he noticed that Pepsodent had mint in it. It had mint oil, and it left this like tingling sensation. So that's what the advertisements really countered on, and what he promoted was that after you brush your teeth, you get this tingling sensation. There was a sort of tangible reward that people could say, oh, I brushed my teeth. And it's interesting because that craving for clean teeth or a fresh mouth or fresh breath is still in play today, because we don't actually need mint in our toothpaste. I mean, think of all the kids' flavors that have bubble gum or orange or whatnot. How many people would even find that to be rewarding in the sense of having a clean mouth? So Hopkins really hooked into this idea of craving that minty, fresh feeling, and that will mean that your teeth are clean. That habit loop can be carried over to practically anything that we're doing in our lives, but it's really necessary to, as he says, dissect the habit. And you really want to look at what are the cues and what are the rewards that I want. The routine is what changes, and this is called the golden rule of habits, is that normally the cue is going to be the same. And oftentimes the reward is the same, but it's what you're doing in each of those steps, what the behavior is that most likely you want to change. And this is all powered by a craving. And I want to kind of elaborate on the definition of a craving. So when you look up your Google cravings, as I did as part of preparing my research, most of it has to do with, oh, I'm craving, chocolate, or how to not crave potato chips. But cravings are, I invite you to think of them as more emotional and spiritual, neurological cravings, if you will. Like it's something when your brain is anticipating that reward, you really want it and you start thinking about it more and more, or you make decisions based on satisfying that craving. For me personally, I love movement. That is a keystone habit of mine, if you will, and that I usually make the choice not if I'm going to work out, or it's mostly when. And I'm talking about movement in the sense of maybe it's a walk with my dog, maybe it's a dance workout, maybe it is doing a little bit of yoga or stretching, or maybe it is a really heavy duty, pushing 400-pound sled at the gym. It sometimes the actual routine, it doesn't necessarily matter as much, but that is a keystone habit of mine. And that craving, in my case, is a satisfying of that endorphin rush. I kind of joke around that I have an addiction to endorphins. Like, it's relatively easy for me to prioritize working out because I really want that feeling of working out. I know when that endorphin rush is going to kick in. Also, one of my keystone habits is connection. I like being around people. I get lonely when I'm here in my office for too many hours at a time. And things like Toastmasters really help to fulfill that connection with other people. And coaching is something that also helps me to fulfill. So every Tuesday, I have a routine in which I go to my Toastmasters meeting. So the important part of dissecting that habit loop is really looking at what are those rewards and what are those cravings. On Charles Duhigg's website, he has a really awesome, really in-depth document about how to change a habit and how to create a habit. And he asks some really in-depth questions here as far as part of that, like, what time is it? Where are you? Who are you around? What did you do? And if you spend some time going through those cues, then, and also what is that reward that you're actually seeking, then you can change that routine. In the habit loop, he shares some of his own issues around every day he was going up and going to the cafeteria to get a cookie, and he would leave post-it notes, don't eat the cookie, and he would every day kind of be fighting with himself, like, okay, tomorrow I'm not eating any cookies. And I'm sure we've all kind of been there. Well, he performed his own habit loop dissection and used this process to kind of get at the reasonings for, or an understanding of what was happening. So he did something very, very important in his goal to understand how the craving was driving his behavior, is he went through that question. And the cue was always ended up being the same. He noticed a pattern that it was around 3:00 that he would want to leave or want the cookie. And then he would go to the cafeteria. Well, he substituted different things. Some days he would have an apple. Some days he would have a candy bar. Some days he would have water. Some days he didn't go to the cafeteria. Some days he would go for a walk. So he changed up the routine, and then he would notice, how was he feeling? Did that reward satisfy the craving? And what he found was that he actually was craving distraction and socialization. So his new habit became, I'm going to the cafeteria, or I'm going to have 10 minutes to go chat with my colleagues. So that part of, dissecting that habit loop and really asking those questions about and noticing the patterns were really, really important. And then really paying attention to what was that reward. And so once you go through this process of evaluating, then you can think about and create a plan. And your plan is what you put in place to develop a new habit. So that part, there's also resources for how to create a habit. And I will be posting these on my website with links to his site. So a couple of tips around habits, some things to think about that I have found really important as part of this process is, with habits, you want to realize that the brain wants it to be easy. That's what's so awesome about habits. And the reason why it is hard to change is because you're using a different part of the brain. When you're making decisions that are requiring deep processes or analyzation, or it's something unfamiliar or something uncomfortable, you're using your prefrontal cortex. It's engaging a more intense, deeper thinking aspect of things, where the brain is hard at work at what is going on. The brain is actually kind of lazy. And when you get to the point where your habits are automatic like that, it switches from using that prefrontal cortex for decision making into the area of the brain called the basal ganglia. And that is a more primitive area of the brain. It was the first parts of the brain, and it's more kind of our lizard brain or animalistic. And the brain that loves it when we're in that place, because it's safe, it knows what's happening, it doesn't have to do all this extra work. And that's why sometimes those habits that we're making seem kind of almost self-sabotaging in some ways. It's because there's the deeper part of our brain where it's so ingrained and it's so easy. It's why, in simple terms, it's why we can back out of our cars without even thinking about it. But at some point when we were driving, we had to really concentrate, right? And that's switching from prefrontal cortex to our basal ganglia. So the point with the habit is to really understand that you're going to have resistance around that, and your brain's going to not like that. And it's going to take repetition so that it becomes more comfortable, and it moves into that habit where you just don't even think about it. But you've got to give it some time, and you also need to have some patience with yourself and understand what's happening within your brain, and that a lot of times it's really, really just trying to keep you safe, in its sort of lazy sort of way. So think about that from the perspective of when you're putting in a new habit and when you're trying to do something new, and why it does take so much effort sometimes. Other tips when it comes to habits is I invite you and I encourage you to really, really cultivate the why, and cultivate why it's important to you beyond just a number on a scale. For example, with losing weight, that's just, in some ways, it's not that motivating. And having a feeling around that you're seeking is really going to help in those moments where you do feel uncomfortable, or it would be easier to slip back into, primitive, lazy lizard brain and just do what you've always done. But if you have something that hooks into that's super meaningful, then that will be much easier and more motivating and inspiring, really, to keep going with whatever you're doing. And if you can articulate that and write it out, it is definitely, more helpful, especially in those challenging times. And that reward, like, I would really recommend having that reward very much available and some accessible, if you will. Like, make it a visual picture. Envision what it's like when you're going to get that reward. Envision that feeling of accomplishment. Allow your brain the brain loves rewards. And I was, in my studies, I was reading about how someone took 5 different wine bottles, and it was a really big project. And so they wrote down milestones on the wine bottles, and every time they reached that milestone, they were able to open a bottle of wine. So it's not like the reward has to be super huge. It's not like you're saying, oh, I'm going on a cruise or whatever, but something that's meaningful and personal to you, so that you can picture that and let that be motivating, and then celebrate it. Just like really, really allow yourself to celebrate when you've accomplished something that means something to you, and when it has to be, a new habit. A few other tips is to make the cue simple. So like with working out, they say, put your tennis shoes or your sneakers out somewhere that you will see them, and they'll be, easy to, click on that recognition of what's happening. Another instance is a strategy of convenience, is something that Gretchen Rubin of the Happier podcast talks about. I have a giant water bottle. This is seriously my water bottle. I fill it up twice a day. I can sit here at my desk when I'm working. I don't even have to do anything. I just drink my water like this. So this is a strategy of convenience. Now I noticed something really crazy. We got a new refrigerator, and the water spout was a little harder to get this in. And I realized I was not filling up my water bottle. I was using a different water bottle for a couple of weeks, and I felt really thirsty. And I realized that the strategy of inconvenience had gone away. I wasn't using this water bottle because it was slightly more inconvenient to fill this one up. Then I ended up thirsty. So now I've had to go back to my habit of making sure that I fill up this water bottle. Another, in the book Atomic Habits, James Clear is the author of that, and he talks about environment. So if you are in an environment, say you work somewhere and there's always, donuts or whatever around, what is the routine, the habit that you're going to have in place to deal with that situation? So if you're prepared for it, and then, it's not just like, oh, today I'm not going to eat any cookies. That would be, or any donuts. This would be a case of running through that habit loop and running through that worksheet as far as figuring out, okay, well, what is the plan? And what is it that I'm really, really seeking as far as, eating that particular snack or whatever? Because again, I invite you to think about it beyond just that dopamine hit that you might get from sugar. Is there something else, going on that's a little bit deeper, and how can you develop a plan or a habit that would be more fulfilling than that particular one? Repeating your habits and keeping track of it. Another item that I will share is from The One Thing. And I have not read this book, but I've listened to a few of their podcasts. And in it, they talk about how it takes 66 days to form a habit. So this is a nice tracker. So if you do have a new habit that you want to have in place, that you can use that. So I will share the workbook or the link for that as well. And, community and accountability and support, and that's also really, really beneficial when you're trying to institute a new habit. I know for me, I love to send my trainer the food that I'm eating. Not as much because I feel like I'm looking for his approval or even for ideas, because my food is pretty much on point. But there's something about, I'm a bit of a snacker, and there's something about knowing if I have to send him pictures of food that maybe I won't have as much, or I won't do this. And because sometimes it's totally not because of any kind of hunger or anything like that. So, I know, and just having a coach in general, like for me, time management is something that I talk a lot about with my coach. And so we have accountability around, goals and things like that. And I think work habits are kind of also important as far as that goes. The last thing I really recommend is that reward and savor and celebration. And hopefully I have a reward planned out for once I share and send out this video. And it's something that, is keeping me, motivated, inspired, even though I had other things that I could have or should have been doing today. I think I love the statement that Duhigg writes in the book, and I'm just going to read it real quick. Habits shape our lives far more than we realize. They are so strong, in fact, that they cause our brains to cling to them at the exclusion of all else. Amazing, including common sense. Habits are powerful but delicate. They can emerge outside our consciousness, or they can be deliberately designed. Deliberately designed. You can deliberately design your habits. Hopefully, if you've never considered that, that this will be a takeaway for you, that you can deliberately design your habits. So, whatever habit you would like to bring into your life, someday I hope that it is easy as brushing your teeth. I know you can do it. I believe in you. Thank you.